When we are talking about tropical regions, regions that were formerly colonized, it is impossible to detach the environmental crisis from this process of land dispossession that local populations underwent in the 19th century in these regions. So a process of labor transformation that happened in Europe due to the Industrial Revolution also happened in the agricultural sector in colonized territory. They just assume that property relations have always been the way they are now. They had very weak legal foundations, and we see through historical research many cases of fabrication and forgery as well. Hello, everybody. My name is Mariana Dias Paes, and I'm assistant professor for law and society in the American University of Paris. I'm a legal historian by training, so you might be asking yourselves, what is a legal historian actually doing here, talking in an event about the climate crisis? Well, I hope I'll be able to convince you by the end of my presentation today that legal history is an important field to take into consideration when we think about how are we going to deal with the environmental destruction that is going in the world today. Usually, when we think about law in the environment, we think about law as a source of solutions. So we think about environmental regulations, the field of environmental law, international treaties, litigation against industries, and so on and so forth. However, my research focuses not on law as a solution to the environmental crisis, but actually on law as a cause of the environmental crisis. So how law created institutional mechanisms that enabled wide environmental destruction, especially in tropical regions of the world. So my argument is that during the colonial period, and especially during the 19th century, colonial law created institutional mechanisms that allowed for unprecedented land dispossession and environment destruction of rainforests in the Atlantic world. The legal framework that enabled this environmental destruction in the 19th century is still the cornerstone of law and legal systems imposed in post-independence countries, and is still frame the way courts deal with environmental related issues. So if you take a look at courts in countries that were formerly colonized in the South Atlantic region, you will see that most environmentally related cases, they reach courts as land disputes. So when we are talking about tropical regions, regions that were formerly colonized, it is impossible to detach the environmental crisis from this process of land dispossession that local populations underwent in the 19th century in these regions. My research focuses on 3 rainforest regions: the Amazonian rainforest, the Congo rainforest, and the Atlantic forest. These are regions that they not only share biological environmental characteristics, but they also share a colonial past. We are talking about regions that have been under Portuguese first, and then later French and Belgian colonialism for almost 400 years. Today, I'm going to present to you a case study focused on the Atlantic forest. The Atlantic forest is not so well known as the Amazon forest, so maybe some of you never heard about its existence. And one of the reasons for that is because the Atlantic forest is almost entirely destroyed by now. Today, the Atlantic forest has the size of 15% of its original size. You can see in this map that I'm showing in the PowerPoint presentation, the light green and yellow colors represent the original coverture of the Atlantic forest, and what you see in dark green is what we have today. So this is a case of massive environmental destruction of a rainforest that points to us these historical processes and these colonial legacies that also affect the Amazon and the Congo rainforests. So, colonial occupation of the Atlantic forest started in 1500s, in the 16th centuries, and you will see in some studies a discourse that says environmental destruction in the Americas is pretty much linked to early modern colonialism, because this is a moment when Europeans transplant to the Americas the idea of private property that is foreign, that conflicted with communal ways to hold land of indigenous populations. So this dichotomy between private property and communal property is a very deeply rooted historical misconception. Because by looking at the case of the Atlantic forest, what we see is that in the early modern period, that is, in these first centuries of colonialism in the Atlantic world, European legal systems, they did not operate in the framework of what we understand today as private property. The Portuguese, for instance, the ones that colonized what is today the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Brazil, the word propietas, property, did not refer to what we today understand as property. It referred to public offices, for instance. So for you to have an idea, private property is a historically contingent construction that did not exist in the first centuries of European colonial expansion in the Atlantic world. So what did we have at this point? So until the 19th century, European legal systems, and here I mean French, Spanish, Portuguese, they regulated land relations, departing from the idea of possession. That is, you have rights over land recognized as long as you actually use and occupy this land. There was no idea of an individually absolute owned property. You could have different people have different types of rights over the same plot of land. And written titles, they existed, but they were extremely marginal in regulating ownership regimes. So, for instance, if you look at the land disputes that were filed in colonial courts during this period, even if a litigant presented a written title, if the other part was able to prove possession would win the case. And when did this change? It changed primarily during the 19th century. So the 19th century was a very important turning point in the history of the rainforests of the Atlantic and of their destruction. First, this is a very complex process. We have transformations in different areas that actually led to this unprecedented environmental destruction in the region. First, we have a shift in technology. As you all know, by the end of the 18th century, Europe is experiencing the Industrial Revolution, and this deeply affected the colonial environment in the South Atlantic. Just to show you a quick image so you have an idea of how industrial technology affected the colonies' economies. This is an image of a sugar mill in the mid-16th century in the Caribbean, and then another image of a sugar mill in Cuba in the mid-19th century. So as you can see, sugar mills changed dramatically after the Industrial Revolution. Plantations in the Americas, in West Africa, they became as factories, as industries, in the way they organized labor, in the way they controlled labor, huge towers with clocks were installed in the plantations, so workers needed to comply with a specific time regulation, quotas were instituted, repetitive tasks. So a process of labor transformation that happened in Europe due to the Industrial Revolution also happened in the agricultural sector in colonized territory. These technological changes also had a huge impact in commercial agriculture. Of course, everybody knows this. Since the beginning of European colonial expansion in the 16th century, commercial agriculture, the production of commodities, was very important to colonial economies. However, after the Industrial Revolution, commercial agriculture incorporates technological changes that lead to an unprecedented expansion of this activity and to an unprecedented land grab in these territories. In addition to this, these new formats that commercial agriculture acquired in the Atlantic world in the 19th century led to the reconfiguration of labor relations, not only in the sense that it became very similar to this idea that we have of factory work, but also it led to the expansion of slavery. So the numbers of the transatlantic slave trade for the 19th century, they are extremely high. So historians point out that there is not an incompatibility between capitalism and slavery, for instance, but this is another story. From the legal point of view, we see the creation of property rights. So, as I told you before, property rights did not exist since always, not even in European legal systems. Property rights are a creation of, as we understand them today, they are a creation of the 19th century. So now the individual is going to be the focus of legal systems. Each individual has a set of what we call subjective rights. Property is one of them. Consequently, if now individuals are holders of these subjective rights, the nation states need to be able to protect these rights. For that, nation states create registration systems that would identify these individual property owners and would register them. And this is when we start to see the written documents, the written titles, the property registers becoming the main piece of evidence of ownership rights in legal regimes. So we see a shift from possession to title. And the production of title, which corresponds to the production of property rights as well in the 19th century, was highly dependent on your political and economic strength. So we see that elites in colonized territory, they have more access to state institutions, so they are able to register in their name property that previously belonged to indigenous people, to free African descendants in the Americas, or to traditional local populations. So many of the titles created in this context in the 19th century, they had very weak legal foundations, and we see through historical research many cases of fabrication and forgery as well. So the written title has a way to prove property rights is historically has very weak legal foundations, because we see that they were created in this context of elites and dispossession of local populations. And finally, one last important transformation of the 19th century is the expansion of pseudoscientific racist ideas that highly impact legal systems. So in this movement that people were going to the state, they were creating their property rights, racist ideas about indigenous populations, African populations, local traditional populations made this process easier for elites, because scientists and also jurists started to look at non-white population and to claim that the way they used the land, the way they occupied the land, had nothing to do with a scientific, rational use of the land, and consequently, this should not be converted into property. It should not be protected by the legal system. So what we see in the 19th century is this turning point in what comes to the legal regulation of the access to land that led to an unprecedented land dispossession in the 19th century. Again, of course, there was land dispossession in the early modern colonialism, but due to all these reasons that I mentioned to you, the 19th century process was a much more intense process. And this land dispossession also led to the genocide of local populations that resisted the same process of land dispossession, and also led to this unprecedented destruction of rainforests. In the case of the Atlantic forest, we see it was almost entirely destructed. And the Amazon rainforest, which by the beginning of the 19th century was pretty well preserved. There was very little European colonial economic activity in the Amazon, for instance, until the end of the 19th century. Now, with the new technology, with the expansion of commodity frontiers, it became also a place where this joint activity of land possession, commercial agriculture, deforestation was taking place. So, how this affects local communities, how this affects rainforests today, I'm going to give you a quick example of that. So, in 2023, a Brazilian federal court in the state of Ceará, they heard a case that was a land dispute between a local indigenous community and a coconut industry. And ultimately, the court ruled in favor of the indigenous community. Nevertheless, they did so because the indigenous community was able to produce a piece of paper that dated from the colonial period. It was a document issued by the Portuguese crown that recognized that the plot of land belonged to the indigenous community. So because the indigenous community was able to produce this written piece of evidence dating from the colonial period, they had their rights protected by the court. But this is far from being the most common situation. Usually, indigenous communities are not able to produce written proof, written documentation that attest of their immemorial occupation and rights over a piece of land. And this is not only because of like this stereotypical vision, oh, they are indigenous communities, they don't produce written documents. No, it is because for 300 years, more than 300 years, in colonial settings, pieces of paper were not important for anybody, nor for the indigenous communities, nor for the colonial settlers. So, but judges today in Brazil and all over the Atlantic world, they just assume that property relations have always been the way they are now. So they constantly ask for proof of a chain of title, for written proof, and as legal history shows us, this is very difficult to produce when we are talking about moments dating from the early modern period, before pre-19th century period. So one of the main goals of this research is to raise awareness between jurists, between policymakers, that the framework, the legal framework that today rules environmental related disputes that reach courts in these regions of the Atlantic, they were created in this moment where we see expansion of colonialism, racist theories, etc., and so on and so forth. So my goal now is to expand this research from the Atlantic forest to the Amazon and the Congo, as I mentioned to you. And I think that by understanding this centuries-long legal history of these three rainforests, we will be more equipped to identify colonial legacies that are still operating today in the legal systems of these regions, and how these centuries-long colonial legacies are actually affecting the way courts, lawyers, judges are dealing with conflicts related to climate change and the environmental crisis. So thank you so much.